Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board revealed secrets only the dead could know. Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be one to share something like this, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe some of you can help me make sense of it. It's been haunting me for years, and I feel like I'm going insane. It started innocently enough, as these things often do. Back in college, my friends and I were always up for something to kill the boredom. One night, we were hanging out at Jake's place, a rundown old house his parents rented out to college students. Jake's house was the perfect place for late night drinking and stupid dares. It was an old Victorian with creaky floors, dim lighting, and a history that felt thick in the air. So, it's a Friday night, we're all a few beers in, and Jake pulls out this old Ouija board he found in the attic. Classic, right? I know it sounds cliche, but I swear to you, this thing was ancient, the wood was worn, and the letters were faded. It had this unsettling vibe, like it had seen some serious shit over the years. We set it up on the coffee table, lighting a few candles to set the mood. The room was dim, with shadows dancing on the walls, and the air felt colder than usual. It was me, Jake, Sarah, and Tony. Just four idiots looking for a cheap thrill. We put our fingers on the planchette, and Jake starts the whole, "Is anyone there?" spiel. At first, nothing happened. We laughed it off, calling each other out for moving the planchette. But then, it started to move. Slowly, deliberately. We all looked at each other, the smirks fading from our faces. The planchette spelled out, "Yes." Sarah chuckled nervously. "All right, who's doing that?" Jake swore it wasn't him, and I could tell from his face he wasn't lying. We continued, asking stupid questions at first, like, "What's your name?" and "How did you die?" The answers were vague and uninteresting until Sarah asked, "What do you want?" The planchette shot to hurt. That wiped the smiles off our faces real quick. Tony, the skeptic of the group, called bullshit and wanted to stop, but something in me needed to see where this was going. I asked, "Who do you want to hurt?" The planchette spelled out, "You." My heart pounded, but I tried to play it cool. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Revenge," it spelled out. Jake was pale, and I could see he was regretting bringing the board out. But we were in too deep now. I asked, "For what?" The board spelled out murder. We all exchanged glances. None of us had killed anyone. This had to be a sick joke, right? But the room felt heavy, like something was pressing down on us. Then it spelled out a name. Michael. Jake's face went white. He whispered, "Michael was my brother. He died when we were kids." The room went dead silent. Jake never talked about his family, especially his brother. This was beyond fucked up. Jake asked, "Michael, is that you?" The planchette moved to yes. Tears welled up in Jake's eyes. "How? How can this be real? Murder," the board spelled out again. Jake shook his head. "No, it was an accident. You drowned. I tried to save you." "Liar," the board spelled. Jake broke down, sobbing. Sarah and Tony tried to console him, but I couldn't take my eyes off the board. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. It felt like someone was watching us. Jake screamed, "I'm sorry. I was just a kid. I didn't know." The planchette started to move erratically, spelling out random letters and then stopping suddenly. The candles flickered, and we all felt this cold breeze sweep through the room. I wanted to end the session, but I was frozen in place. Jake asked one more question. "What do you want from me?" The planchette moved slowly this time, spelling out, "Your soul." Jake's eyes widened in terror. We all tried to move the planchette to goodbye, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was glued to the board. The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. Then we heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the corner of the room. I couldn't see anything, but I felt this presence, this pure evil. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before. We scrambled to get the lights back on, but when we did, the board was gone. Just gone. Vanished into thin air. Jake was a mess, muttering apologies to his dead brother, and the rest of us were just trying to process what the hell had just happened. We decided to leave the house, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Over the next few days, Jake's behaviour became increasingly erratic. He kept saying he could hear Michael's voice, accusing him, taunting him. He started getting these violent outbursts, smashing things, screaming at nothing. One night, we got a call from his roommate, saying Jake had been found in the attic, dead. He'd hanged himself. The police ruled it a suicide, but I know what I saw. His face was twisted in terror, and on the wall, written in what looked like blood, was the word revenge. Since that night, I've been haunted by nightmares. I can hear whispers in the dark, feel cold hands touching me when I'm alone. I'm convinced something came through that night, something evil, and it's not done with me yet. If you ever find an old Ouija board, leave it the fuck alone. Trust me, some doors are better left unopened. After Jake's death, the group fell apart. Sarah moved back home, Tony dropped out, and I just tried to keep my head down. But the nightmares got worse. I started seeing Jake in my dreams. His face twisted in the same terror I saw the night he died. He kept whispering, "Revenge," over and over. I thought I was losing my mind. I tried to forget, but how can you forget something like that? Every creak in my apartment, every shadow in the corner of my eye, it all felt like a constant reminder of that night. But it wasn't just paranoia. Things started happening. Real things. It began with small stuff. I'd find objects moved around, like my keys not being where I left them, or pictures on the wall turned upside down. Then, one night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I never sleep with the door open. I got up, heart pounding, and closed it. As I turned to go back to bed, I saw it. Scratches on the inside of the door, like someone had clawed at it from the outside. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was sleepwalking or something. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I felt this coldness around me, this sense of being watched. I decided to call Sarah, needing to hear a familiar voice. She answered, sounding groggy. "Hey, it's late. What's up?" I told her about the scratches, the feeling of being watched. There was silence on the other end for a moment before she whispered, "It's happening to me too." Sarah told me about her own experiences, objects moving, doors opening by themselves, and worst of all, the feeling of cold hands around her throat when she tried to sleep. She had seen a therapist, tried to get help, but nothing worked. We both knew what was happening, but admitting it made it too real, too terrifying to handle. We decided to meet up, hoping that being together might help us figure something out. We met at a small diner, the kind of place where you can get lost in a booth and talk without being overheard. Sarah looked like hell, dark circles under her eyes, trembling hands. I must have looked the same. We exchanged stories, realizing that our experiences were almost identical. We both felt the presence of something evil, something that wanted to hurt us. Then Sarah dropped a bombshell. "I did some research," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "On Michael." I leaned in, feeling my stomach drop. "What did you find?" Sarah pulled out a file from her bag. Jake's brother didn't just drown. There were rumours, whispers about their family, about abuse, about murder. I felt sick. Murder? But Jake said it was an accident. Maybe he believed that, Sarah said, her eyes hollow. But the rumours said otherwise. Michael's death was always suspicious. Jake's parents were abusive. People thought they might have had something to do with it. My mind was reeling. If Jake's parents had something to do with Michael's death, and Jake knew or found out, it could explain a lot. But how did that connect to what was happening now? As we talked, I felt this growing sense of dread. The lights in the diner flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop. We both felt it. The presence was there, with us, even in that public place. I could see it in Sarah's eyes. She felt it too. We decided to go back to Jake's house, to the place where it all started. We had to confront whatever it was head on. I wasn't sure what we were looking for, but I knew we couldn't keep running from it. We needed answers. That night, armed with flashlights and a heavy sense of dread, we returned to the old Victorian house. It was abandoned now, a ghost of its former self. The door creaked open, and the cold air inside hit us like a wall. Every step echoed through the empty halls, and the darkness seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. We made our way to the attic, the place where Jake had died. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. As we climbed the rickety stairs, I felt that familiar coldness wrap around me, like icy fingers pressing into my skin. Sarah gripped my arm, her flashlight shaking. We reached the attic, and there, scrawled on the walls in what looked like dried blood, was the word revenge. My stomach churned, but we pressed on. We searched through the old boxes, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. Then we found it, an old leather-bound diary hidden in a dusty box. It was Michael's. His handwriting was shaky, the entries filled with fear and pain. He wrote about the abuse, the nights spent hiding from his parents, and finally, the night he died. According to the diary, Michael's death wasn't an accident. Jake's parents had locked him in the attic as punishment, and he had tried to escape through the window, falling to his death. Jake had found him, tried to save him, but it was too late. Michael's last entry was a plea for help, a desperate cry for someone to stop the torment. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she read the final entry aloud. "They'll never stop. I have to get out. If anyone finds this, please don't let them get away with it." As she finished reading, the temperature in the attic dropped sharply, and we heard that same guttural growl from the night with the Ouija board. The room seemed to close in on us, the darkness becoming almost tangible. Then, the attic door slammed shut, trapping us inside. We heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, climbing the stairs. Sarah and I huddled together, our flashlights flickering. The footsteps grew closer, and we saw a shadow at the top of the stairs. It was a figure, indistinct, but undeniably there. It moved towards us, and we felt this overwhelming sense of hatred and pain. The growling grew louder, almost deafening. The figure stopped in front of us, and I could see its eyes, cold, empty, and filled with rage. "Why are you here?" it hissed, the voice sending chills down my spine. "We know the truth," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "We know what happened to Michael." The figure seemed to falter, its form flickering. "They must pay," it whispered, the rage turning into a plea. "Make them pay." And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The attic door creaked open, and we were left in silence. Shaking, we made our way back down the stairs, the weight of what we had learned pressing down on us. As we left the house, I knew what we had to do. We needed to confront Jake's parents, to make them face the consequences of what they had done. It was the only way to end this nightmare. But deep down, I knew that whatever had been unleashed wasn't going to let us go that easily. The next day, we decided to drive to Jake's parents' house. The idea of confronting them made my stomach turn, but I knew we had no choice. The address was easy to find, one of those old, stately homes that seemed to loom over the neighborhood. It had this oppressive presence, like the house itself was part of the evil. We parked a few houses down and sat in the car for a moment, trying to gather our courage. Sarah was shaking, and I felt this cold pit of dread in my stomach. "We can't back out now," I said, more to convince myself than her. We walked up the driveway, each step feeling like it was dragging us deeper into some dark pit. The doorbell echoed through the house, and after a moment, Jake's mother answered. She looked like she hadn't aged well, lines of worry etched into her face, eyes sunken and hollow. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cold and unwelcoming. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to talk to you," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's about Jake and Michael." Her expression hardened and she stepped back, letting us inside. The house was immaculate, but devoid of warmth, like a museum. Mr. Thompson was sitting in the living room, reading a newspaper. He looked up, eyes narrowing when he saw us. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone harsh. Sarah and I exchanged a glance. "We know what happened to Michael," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And we know you were involved." Mrs. Thompson's face went pale, and she gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. Mr. Thompson stood up, towering over us, his face a mask of anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snarled. "We found his diary," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "We know he didn't drown. We know you locked him in the attic." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Mr. Thompson lunged at us, his face twisted in rage. "Get out!" he bellowed, grabbing Sarah by the arm and dragging her towards the door. I tried to intervene, but he shoved me aside, his strength surprising. "Don't come back here," Mrs. Thompson hissed, tears streaming down her face. "You don't know anything." She slammed the door in our faces, and we stumbled back to the car, hearts pounding. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them standing in the doorway, their faces pale and eyes full of fear. We didn't speak much on the drive back. What could we say? The confrontation had gone horribly wrong, and now we were more scared than ever. We decided to stop at a diner to regroup and figure out our next move. Sitting in the booth, the weight of what we had done settled on us. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't stop," I said, though my own voice was filled with doubt. "We need to find more proof, something we can use to make them pay." But as the words left my mouth, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. We were dealing with something far beyond our control, something that didn't want the truth to come out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. Around 3 a.m. I heard it, a faint whispering coming from the corner of my room. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing there. It was Jake, or what was left of him. His face was twisted in agony, his eyes hollow and dark. "They won't stop," he whispered, his voice a mix of anger and pain. "You have to make them pay." I felt paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Jake's figure moved closer, his presence cold and suffocating. "Do it," he hissed, his face inches from mine, "or they'll come for you next." Then he was gone, leaving me gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. I knew then that there was no turning back. This wasn't just about getting justice for Michael. This was about survival. The next morning, I called Sarah and told her what happened. She sounded just as shaken. "We need to find more evidence," she said. "Something that will force them to confess." We decided to go back to Jake's house one more time, hoping to find something we had missed. The house was even more foreboding in the daylight, the shadows seeming to cling to it like a shroud. We went straight to the attic, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. We searched through the boxes again, every creak of the floorboards making my heart skip a beat. Then, behind a pile of old clothes, we found a small locked box. It was rusty and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. We pried it open with a screwdriver, the lid creaking as it gave way. Inside, we found photographs, letters, and a small, blood-stained teddy bear. The photos showed Michael, his face bruised and scared. The letters were desperate pleas for help. One letter stood out. It was written by Jake, a confession of sorts. He wrote about how he had found Michael that night, how he had tried to cover up what his parents had done out of fear. He wrote about the guilt that had eaten away at him for years, the nightmares and the whispers of revenge. We had what we needed. We took everything to the police, handing over the evidence with trembling hands. They took us seriously, especially after seeing the photographs and letters. An investigation was launched, and Jake's parents were arrested. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the same cold presence. The whispers were louder, angrier. "You're next," they hissed. "You'll never be free." I realized then that this wasn't just about justice. The evil we had unleashed wasn't going to stop, not until it had consumed everything. The news of Jake's parents' arrest spread quickly, and while the town buzzed with shock and curiosity, Sarah and I felt no relief. If anything, the dread deepened. We had exposed the darkness, but it felt like it had only grown stronger, more desperate. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My apartment felt like a prison. every shadow a potential threat. Sarah was no better. She called me in the middle of the night, sobbing, saying she could hear Michael's voice, accusing her, blaming her for everything. One night, as I was pacing around my apartment, trying to keep the panic at bay, my phone rang. It was Tony. I hadn't heard from him since Jake's death, and my stomach dropped at the thought of what he might have to say. "Hey man," he said, his voice strained. "I need to talk to you. It's important. We agreed to meet at a nearby park, neutral ground where we wouldn't feel so trapped." When I saw him, I was shocked. Tony looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling. "What's going on?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Tony looked around, making sure we were alone. "I've been seeing things, hearing things. It's like I'm losing my mind. And then a few days ago, I found this." He handed me a crumpled piece of paper. It was an old photo of our group, taken at Jake's house. We were all smiling, carefree. But in the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure. It was Michael, or at least something that looked like him. His eyes were hollow, his expression one of pure hatred. "Jesus," I whispered, feeling the blood drain from my face. "What the hell is this?" "I found it in my room," Tony said, his voice shaking. "I think it's a warning. We're next." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was getting worse, more real. We decided to go back to Sarah's place to figure out our next move. Safety in numbers, or at least that's what we hoped. When we arrived, Sarah was a wreck. She was pacing the room, her eyes wild with fear. "He's here," she kept saying. "I can feel him." We sat down, trying to come up with a plan. "We need to end this," I said, though I had no idea how. "Maybe there's something we missed, some way to put him to rest." Tony looked at me, desperation in his eyes. "We need help. Someone who knows about this stuff. A medium or a priest." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "There's an old woman in town, Mrs. Thompson. She's supposed to be, connected to the spirit world. Maybe she can help." We decided to visit her the next day. That night was one of the longest of my life. Every creak, every whisper seemed amplified, like the house itself was alive and taunting me. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of Michael, his eyes filled with rage, his hands reaching out to drag me into the darkness. The next morning, we drove to Mrs. Thompson's house, a small, decrepit place on the edge of town. The garden was overgrown, and the windows were covered with thick curtains, blocking out the light. We knocked on the door, and after what felt like an eternity, it creaked open. Mrs. Thompson was ancient, her eyes cloudy with age, but somehow still sharp. She looked at us, and it felt like she was seeing right through us. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice raspy. "Come in." We followed her inside, the air heavy with the scent of incense and something else, something darker. She led us to a small room filled with candles and strange symbols painted on the walls. "You've stirred up something very old, very angry," she said, sitting down in front of us. "We just want to put it to rest," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean to." Mrs. Thompson held up a hand, silencing her. "It doesn't matter what you meant. The spirit world doesn't care about intentions. What's done is done." She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "This spirit, Michael, he's trapped between worlds. His anger, his pain, it's keeping him here. You need to help him find peace, or he'll never stop." "How do we do that?" Tony asked, his voice desperate. Mrs. Thompson opened her eyes, fixing us with a stern gaze. "You need to go back to where it all began, the place of his death. You need to confront him, acknowledge his pain, and ask for his forgiveness. Only then can he move on." My stomach churned at the thought of going back to that house, but I knew we had no choice. "What if it doesn't work?" I asked, fearing the answer. "Then you'll have to live with the consequences," she said, her voice grim. "But I warn you, the spirit world is not easily appeased. Be careful, and whatever you do, don't show fear." We left her house with a heavy sense of foreboding. That night, we prepared ourselves for what was to come. We gathered at my apartment, going over the plan again and again. Sarah brought candles and sage, hoping they might help protect us. As midnight approached, we drove back to Jake's house. The streets were eerily quiet, the moon casting long shadows on the pavement. The house loomed before us, more menacing than ever. We took a deep breath and stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind us. We made our way to the attic, the air thick with tension. The candles flickered as we lit them, casting an eerie glow on the walls. We stood in a circle, holding hands, and began to speak. "Michael!" I called out, my voice shaking. "We're here to help you. We know what happened to you, and we're sorry. Please show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. The darkness closed in, and we heard it, the growling, the footsteps. Michael's presence was stronger than ever, a palpable force of anger and pain. "Michael," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We're sorry for what happened. We want to help you find peace." The growling grew louder, and we saw his figure appear in the corner of the room. His eyes were hollow, his face twisted in agony. "Why?" he hissed, his voice a mix of rage and sorrow. "Why did you do this?" Tears streamed down my face. "We didn't know. We were just kids. Please forgive us." The room grew colder, the shadows closing in. Michael's figure loomed over us, his presence overwhelming. "You have to let go," Tony said, his voice shaking. "Move on. Find peace." For a moment, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Then, Michael's figure began to fade, the coldness receding. The candles flickered back to life, and the oppressive weight lifted from the room. We stood there shaking, barely able to believe it was over. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The darkness had receded, but it hadn't disappeared. Michael's spirit might have found some peace, but the evil we had unleashed was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. We left Jake's house that night, feeling a fragile sense of relief. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, I thought we might actually be free from this nightmare. But deep down, a part of me knew it wasn't over. Evil like that doesn't just vanish, it lingers. For the next few days, things seemed to calm down. The oppressive feeling of being watched lessened, and the nightmares started to fade. Sarah, Tony, and I tried to get back to our lives, though we stayed in close contact, fearing that the darkness might return. Then, one night, I got a call from Tony. His voice was frantic, barely coherent. "You need to come over," he gasped. "Now, it's back." My heart sank. I grabbed my keys and drove to Tony's apartment as fast as I could, dread clawing at my insides. When I got there, I found Tony pacing the living room, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" I demanded, my own fear rising. Tony held up his phone. On the screen was a video, the image shaky and dark. "I set up a camera last night, just in case. Watch this." I took the phone, my hands trembling, and pressed play. The video showed Tony's bedroom, dimly lit. At first, nothing happened. Then, around 3 a.m, the screen flickered, and a shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the room. It moved slowly towards the bed, its form shifting and indistinct. Tony was tossing and turning, clearly restless. The figure leaned over him, and I could see its face. Michael's face, twisted in pain and rage. The figure whispered something, though the audio was too faint to make out. Tony's body jerked violently, and the figure vanished. "Jesus, Tony," I whispered, handing the phone back. "This isn't over." Tony nodded, tears in his eyes. "I can't do this anymore, man. It's tearing me apart." Just then, Sarah burst through the door, looking just as terrified. "It's happening to me too," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw him in my dreams. He said he wasn't done with us." We sat down, trying to make sense of it all. "We did what Mrs. Thompson said," I muttered, frustration and fear boiling inside me. "Why isn't it over?" "Maybe we missed something," Sarah suggested. "Or maybe it's not just Michael. Maybe there's something else, something darker." We decided to go back to Mrs. Thompson's house, desperate for answers. The drive felt surreal, the world outside a blur. When we arrived, the house looked even more foreboding than before. We knocked on the door, and after a long moment, Mrs. Thompson answered, her expression grave. "You're back," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. "I feared this might happen. Come in." We followed her inside, the air thick with incense and tension. She led us to the same room, the candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Tell me everything," she said, her eyes piercing. We explained what had happened since our last visit, the video, the dreams, the feeling that it wasn't over. Mrs. Thompson listened, her expression growing darker with each word. "There's something you need to understand," she said finally. "Michael's spirit was only part of the problem. There's an older, more malevolent force at work here. Something that's been feeding on the pain and suffering in that house for years. You might have freed Michael, but you woke something much worse." The room seemed to close in on us, the shadows growing longer and darker. "What do we do?" Tony asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath. "You need to banish it, completely. There's a ritual, but it's dangerous. If you're not careful, it could consume you." We exchanged glances, knowing we had no choice. "Tell us what we need to do," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my insides. She explained the ritual, giving us a list of items we would need: candles, salt, specific herbs, and a chant in a language none of us recognized. We gathered everything, the sense of dread growing with each passing moment. That night, we returned to Jake's house one final time. The air was thick with tension, every creak and whisper amplified. We set up the candles in a circle, sprinkling salt around the perimeter. The house seemed to breathe with malevolence, the darkness pressing in on us. We began the chant, our voices shaking but determined. The air grew colder, the shadows closing in. As we reached the final part of the ritual, a loud, guttural growl echoed through the house. The shadows writhed and twisted, forming into a shape, a dark, twisted figure with hollow eyes and a face contorted in rage. "Begone!" Mrs. Thompson shouted, her voice commanding. "Return to the void from whence you came." The figure howled, the sound piercing and filled with rage. It lunged at us, but the salt circle held it back. We continued the chant, our voices growing stronger, more determined. The figure writhed, its form flickering and growing weaker. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the figure exploded into a cloud of dark smoke, which dissipated into the air. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. We stood there shaking, barely able to believe it was over. Mrs. Thompson looked at us, her expression weary but relieved. "It's done," she said. "The evil has been banished." We left the house, the air feeling lighter, freer. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty road. The nightmares stopped after that, and the feeling of being watched gradually faded. Sarah, Tony, and I stayed close, bound by the shared horror of what we had experienced. We tried to move on, to rebuild our lives, but we would always carry the scars of that night. We learned a harsh lesson. Some doors are better left unopened, and some secrets should stay buried. Evil is real, and it lurks in the shadows, waiting for the unwary to stumble into its grasp. We had survived, but we would never be the same. The board knew things about my past. No one could have known. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, and all that stuff. Just stories for kids and gullible adults. Or at least, that's what I used to think. Everything changed when I found that damn board. A few months ago, I moved into a new apartment. It's an old building, kind of run down, but it's cheap and close to work. Plus, the landlord didn't ask too many questions, just the way I like it. The place had been empty for a while, so it was pretty dusty and needed a good cleaning. I spent the first weekend scrubbing, airing out rooms and getting rid of old junk left behind by the previous tenant. Most of it was useless, but in the back of the closet, I found something that caught my eye. It was a wooden board about the size of a small coffee table. At first, I thought it was some sort of game. There were letters, numbers, and a bunch of strange symbols carved into it. A Ouija board. I'd seen them in movies, but never in real life. I thought about tossing it, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe just the idea of having something a little mysterious in my otherwise boring life. So I kept it. That night, after a couple of beers, I decided to give it a try. Why not? I set it on the coffee table, lit a few candles, because that's what you're supposed to do, right? And placed my fingers on the planchette. "Is there anyone here with me?" I asked, feeling like a complete idiot. Nothing happened at first. I laughed at myself for even trying, and was about to put it away when the planchette started to move. Just a little at first, a slow, shaky slide across the board. I figured it was just my hand trembling, but then it picked up speed. My heart pounded in my chest as the planchette spelled out, "Yes, okay, weird, but probably just my imagination." "What's your name?" I asked, feeling silly but also a little excited. The planchette moved again, faster this time. David. "David, huh?" I said. "How did you die?" I regretted the question as soon as it left my mouth. What was I doing, talking to a piece of wood like it could actually respond? The planchette didn't move for a long time. I was about to put the board away when it started again, this time more forcefully. Murder. I shivered. This was getting creepy. I decided I'd had enough and said goodnight, pushing the board aside. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Little things at first. Objects moving around, lights flickering, doors creaking open by themselves. I tried to brush it off, but it was hard to ignore. Then the nightmares started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing. The dreams were always the same. I was in my old childhood home, but it was dark and decayed. I'd wander through the halls, calling for my parents, but the only response was an eerie, disembodied voice whispering my name. "Tom! Tom!" It sounded like my father, but I knew it wasn't him. The voice was wrong, twisted. One night, I woke up to find the board sitting on my bed. I hadn't touched it since that first night, and I was sure I'd left it in the living room. But there it was, the planchette resting in the center. My heart pounded as I stared at it, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I picked it up and threw it in the closet, slamming the door shut. But it didn't stay there for long. The next day, I found it on the kitchen table, then in the bathroom. No matter where I put it, it always found its way back. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The board seemed to have a life of its own. Things escalated quickly. The nightmares became more vivid, more disturbing. I'd see visions of my parents, their faces twisted in agony, blood pouring from their mouths as they screamed for help. I'd wake up to find scratches on my arms and legs, as if something had clawed at me while I slept. I started losing track of time, blacking out for hours, only to wake up in strange places around the apartment. One night, I came to in the basement, the board in front of me. The planchette was moving on its own, spelling out a message. "Tell them," it said. "Tell them what you did." I stared at the board, my mind racing. What was it talking about? I hadn't done anything, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something, a memory I'd buried so deep, I'd almost forgotten it. Years ago, when I was a kid, my sister had disappeared. We were playing hide and seek, and I never found her. The police searched for weeks, but never found a trace. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. My parents were devastated, and eventually, our family fell apart. I always told myself it wasn't my fault, that I'd done everything I could to find her. But the truth was, I knew more than I let on. That day, we'd been playing near an old well in the woods behind our house. I told her it was a perfect hiding spot. I dared her to go inside. I never meant for anything to happen, but when she didn't come out, I panicked. I ran home and told my parents I couldn't find her. I didn't tell them about the well. I was too scared. I buried the memory, convinced myself it was an accident. But now, the board was forcing me to confront it. Tell them! It insisted, the planchette moving violently across the board. Tell them what you did. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get rid of the board, but no matter what I tried, burning it, breaking it, even burying it, it always came back. And the messages became more aggressive, more demanding. The board knew things about my past no one could have known. It wanted me to confess, to face what I'd done. But I couldn't, I wouldn't. I wasn't ready to face the truth. So I did the only thing I could think of. I left the apartment, hoping to escape the board and the memories it had unearthed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The board wasn't just an object. It was a reminder, a manifestation of my guilt. And no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. The board knew things about my past no one could have known, and it wasn't going to let me forget. That's where I am now, sitting in a dingy motel room, the board on the bed in front of me. The planchette is moving again, spelling out a new message. You can't run forever, and I know it's right. After leaving the apartment, I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to put as much distance between myself and the board as possible. I finally ended up in a rundown motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where people go when they want to disappear, and that's exactly what I needed. I checked in, paid cash, and didn't give my real name. The room was small and smelled like mildew, but it was a place to crash. I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that I just needed some time to clear my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The nightmares followed me. Every night I'd find myself back in that old, decayed version of my childhood home, wandering the halls, hearing that twisted voice whispering my name. And every night I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the board sitting on the bed beside me. I tried to get rid of it again, throwing it in dumpsters, leaving it on the side of the road. But no matter what I did, it always came back. The messages grew more insistent, more menacing. Tell them, it said over and over, the letters carved into my mind. I started to lose track of time. Days blurred together, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept through the night. The scratches on my arms and legs got worse, deep red welts that stung and bled. I couldn't go to the hospital. How would I explain them? I couldn't tell anyone what was happening. They'd think I was crazy. One night, I woke up to find the room in shambles. The mirror was shattered, the bed overturned, and the board was in the center of the room, the planchette moving frantically. I was covered in blood, my hands shaking. I had no memory of what had happened, but I knew it was getting worse. The board was taking over. I knew I couldn't keep running. I had to face it, to confront whatever it was trying to tell me. I sat down on the floor, my heart pounding, and placed my fingers on the planchette. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette moved quickly, almost violently. "Confess! Confess what?" I screamed. "What do you want from me?" The response was immediate, the letters forming almost too fast to read. "Sister." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The memory of that day by the well, my sister's terrified face as she disappeared into the darkness, flooded back. I'd buried it so deep, convinced myself it was an accident. But the board knew the truth. It wanted me to admit it. I tried to resist, to push the board away, but it was like my hands were glued to the planchette. "It was an accident!" I shouted. "I didn't mean to!" The board responded before I could finish. "Liar!" Tears streamed down my face as I fought to control my hands. "I was just a kid!" I sobbed. "I didn't know." "You knew!" the board insisted, the planchette moving with such force it left scratches in the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the fear, the constant pressure, it was too much. I collapsed on the floor, my body shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." The room grew cold, the air thick with a sense of dread. I felt a presence, something dark and menacing, closing in around me. The board was demanding more than an apology. It wanted me to pay for what I'd done. I stayed in that motel room for days, too afraid to leave, too afraid to sleep. The board was relentless, the messages growing darker, more violent. It wasn't just my sister it wanted me to confess to. It knew everything, every lie, every mistake, every dark thought I'd ever had. It wanted me to face all of it. One night, the pressure became too much. I woke up to find the board on my chest. The planchette moving so quickly it was a blur. End it, it spelled out. End yourself. I threw the board across the room, my heart racing. It crashed into the wall and fell to the floor, but I knew it wouldn't stay there. It would come back, and the messages would get worse. The board knew things about my past no one could have known, and it wasn't going to stop until I did what it wanted. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the room, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away, to clear my head. I drove for hours, the road a blur through my tears. I ended up at a park on the outskirts of town, a place I used to go as a kid. It was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I sat on a bench, the cold night air biting at my skin. I felt a strange sense of calm, a resignation. I couldn't keep running from the board, from my past. I had to face it, no matter how much it hurt. I pulled out my phone and dialed my parents' number. It rang for a long time before my mother answered, her voice groggy with sleep. "Tom, is everything okay?" I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "Mum, I need to tell you something," I said, my voice shaking. "It's about Jenny." There was a long pause and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "What about Jenny?" I closed my eyes, the memory of that day by the well flooding back. "I lied," I said, the words barely a whisper. "I knew where she was. I knew all along." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could hear my mother's breath hitch, the sound of her trying to hold back tears. "What do you mean, Tom?" I took another deep breath, the tears streaming down my face. "We were playing near the well," I said. "I dared her to go inside. I thought it was just a game, but when she didn't come out, I panicked. I ran home and told you I couldn't find her. I'm so sorry, Mum. I never meant for this to happen." The silence stretched on, my mother's sobs the only sound. I felt a strange sense of relief, the weight of my guilt lifting slightly. But I knew it wasn't enough. The board wouldn't stop until I paid for what I'd done. "I'm so sorry," I repeated, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." "I don't know what to say, Tom," my mother finally said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to your father." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I understand," I said. "I'll be here." The call ended, and I sat on the bench, staring at my phone. I'd confessed, but it didn't feel like enough. The board wanted more. It wanted my life. I drove back to the motel, the dread settling in my stomach like a lead weight. I knew what I had to do, but I was terrified. The board was waiting for me, the planchette moving slowly, deliberately. "You know what to do," it spelled out. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The planchette moved to the letters, spelling out one final message. "End it. End yourself." I stared at the board, the reality of what it was asking sinking in. It wasn't just a game. It was a sentence, a judgment on my soul. I'd never been a religious person, but in that moment, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something dark and eternal. I don't know what's going to happen next. The board is still here, the messages growing more insistent, more demanding. I don't know how much longer I can hold out, but one thing is clear. The board knew things about my past no one could have known, and it won't stop until I do what it wants. I don't know if anyone will read this, or if it will even matter, but I had to tell someone, had to get it out there. If you find this, please, be careful. Don't play with things you don't understand, and if you ever come across a board like this, leave it alone. It knows things, and it won't stop until it has what it wants. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the board. The words "end it" burning into my mind. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to do what it wanted. The next morning, I decided I needed help. I couldn't handle this on my own anymore. I called my friend Mark, the only person I thought might believe me. Mark was into all sorts of paranormal stuff. Ghost hunting, urban legends, you name it. If anyone could help, it was him. "Hey man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to talk to you. It's about something weird. Can we meet up?" Mark didn't hesitate. "Sure thing, Tom. Where are you?" I gave him the address of the motel and waited, my nerves frayed. When he arrived, he took one look at me and knew something was seriously wrong. "Jesus, Tom, you look like hell," he said. "What's going on?" I told him everything. The board, the messages, the nightmares, the way it knew things about my past no one could have known. Mark listened, his face growing more serious with every word. When I finished, he didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like you've got a real problem here," he said. "I've heard of things like this, objects that seem to have a will of their own. But this is on another level." "So what do I do?" I asked, desperate for some kind of solution. Mark frowned, thinking. "First, we need to see the board," he said. "Maybe there's something we're missing." We went back to my room, and sure enough, the board was waiting for us on the bed, the planchette in the centre. Mark examined it closely, running his fingers over the carvings, the symbols. "This is old," he said, "really old. And these symbols, they're not just random, they're part of some kind of ritual." "What kind of ritual?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Mark shook his head. "I'm not sure, but it's definitely not something you should be messing with." He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, muttering to himself. "I'm going to need to do some research," he said. "In the meantime, you need to stay away from this thing. Don't touch it. Don't talk to it. Just leave it alone." I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe Mark could help. Maybe there was a way out of this. But that hope was short-lived. That night, I tried to follow Mark's advice. I stayed out of the room, wandered around the motel parking lot, trying to clear my head. But the board was never far from my thoughts. I could feel it, like a weight in my chest, pulling me back. When I finally returned to the room, I found it in chaos. The bed was overturned, the mirror shattered, and the board was in the centre of the room, the planchette moving furiously. "Liar!" it spelled out. "Traitor!" I felt a wave of nausea, my knees buckling. The board was angry, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it shut, trapping me inside. I turned back to the board, my heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. "I've done everything you asked." The planchette moved quickly, spelling out a new message. "Suffer." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like a knife twisting in my heart. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. The room spun around me, the edges of my vision growing dark. I thought I was dying, that the board was finally taking its revenge. But then the pain stopped, as suddenly as it had begun. I lay on the floor, shaking, tears streaming down my face. The board was still there, the planchette now motionless. It had made its point. I couldn't escape, couldn't hide. It was going to make me suffer, one way or another. The next few days were a blur. I didn't sleep, didn't eat. I could barely think, barely function. The board's messages grew more violent, more demanding. "Confess," it said. "Pay for your sins." I tried to resist, to hold on to some shred of sanity, but it was a losing battle. The board was relentless, its presence suffocating. I felt like I was drowning, sinking deeper and deeper into darkness. One night, I woke up to find the board on my chest, the planchette moving slowly, deliberately. "Do it!" it spelled out. "End it now!" I screamed, throwing the board across the room. But it was no use. It always came back, always found me. I was trapped, with no way out. Mark called, frantic. He'd found something in his research, something that might help. "You need to destroy the board," he said. "But it's not going to be easy. This thing is powerful. You'll need to perform a ritual, something to break its hold on you." "What kind of ritual?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's complicated," Mark said, "but I'll walk you through it. Just hold on a little longer. I clung to his words, desperate for any glimmer of hope. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The board wasn't just an object. It was a force, a malevolent presence that wouldn't let go without a fight. The days that followed were a nightmare. The board's messages grew more intense, more violent. End it, it demanded. Do it now. I tried to follow Mark's instructions, gathering the items for the ritual, preparing myself mentally, but the board fought back, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. I felt like I was losing my mind, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. Finally, the night of the ritual arrived. Mark came to the motel, bringing the items we needed: candles, herbs, a knife. We set everything up, following the instructions he'd found. My hands shook as I lit the candles, the flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, his face pale. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Let's do this." We began the ritual, chanting the words Mark had found, performing the steps as precisely as we could. The air grew thick with tension, the room seeming to vibrate with an unseen force. The board was on the floor between us, the planchette moving erratically. "Stay focused," Mark said, his voice steady. "We're almost there." But as we neared the end, something went wrong. The candles flickered, the flames turning blue. The room grew icy cold, and a low, rumbling growl filled the air. The board's planchette moved wildly, spelling out one final message. "You can't stop me." The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a surge of panic, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Mark shouted something, but his words were lost in the chaos. The board seemed to come alive, a malevolent force that filled the room, pressing down on us. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the room was silent, the board lying still on the floor. Mark was gone, the items from the ritual scattered around the room. I was alone, my body aching, my mind a blur. I staggered to my feet, my head spinning. The board was still there, its presence a dark, oppressive weight. I knew it wasn't over. The ritual had failed, and now I was truly alone. I don't know what happened to Mark, if he's still alive, or if the board took him. But one thing is clear. The board knows things about my past no one could have known, and it won't stop until it has what it wants. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The board is relentless, its demands growing more insistent, more violent. I'm running out of options, out of time. I don't know what's going to happen next, but one thing is certain. The board isn't finished with me yet. After Mark disappeared, things took a turn for the worse. I didn't have anyone else to turn to, and I felt completely isolated. The motel room, once a dingy sanctuary, now felt like a prison. I was trapped with the board, its sinister presence growing stronger every day. The nights were the worst, the nightmares intensified, the visions of my childhood home more vivid and terrifying. I saw my sister's face everywhere, her eyes wide with fear, her voice echoing in my ears. "Tom, help me," she'd whisper over and over until I woke up screaming. One night, after another one of those hellish dreams, I woke up to find something new written on the board. "Look in the mirror." The message sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't ignore it. I stumbled into the bathroom, my heart pounding. The mirror was cracked, the glass dirty and streaked. I stared at my reflection, hardly recognizing the gaunt, hollow-eyed figure staring back at me. And then, slowly, the reflection began to change. My face twisted, the eyes darkening, the mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. "You can't run from me," the reflection said, its voice a low guttural growl. "You know what you did." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The mirror returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something malevolent and hungry. I backed out of the bathroom, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the board again. It was sitting on the bed, the planchette moving slowly. "Face your past," it spelled out. "Remember." I felt a cold dread settle over me. I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to face the truth. But the board wouldn't let me escape. I sat down on the floor staring at it, feeling the weight of its demand. The memories flooded back, more vivid and painful than ever. I saw myself as a child, standing by the well, watching as my sister climbed in. I heard her laughter, her excitement at the game we were playing, and then the scream, the sound of her falling, the silence that followed. I had pushed her. It wasn't an accident. I had pushed her, out of anger, out of jealousy. She had always been the favourite, the golden child, and in that moment I wanted her to disappear. I had never meant for it to go so far, but it had, and I had buried the truth, buried it so deep I had almost convinced myself it wasn't real. The board knew, it had always known, and now it was forcing me to face it, to confront the darkness inside me. I felt a wave of nausea, my body trembling with the weight of my guilt. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry." The board's planchette moved again, slowly, deliberately. "It's too late," it spelled out. "Pay for your sins." I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, the touch icy and paralyzing. I turned, but there was nothing there. The room grew darker, the shadows lengthening, closing in around me. I could hear whispers, voices I recognized. My sister, my parents, even Mark. They were all accusing, condemning. "You knew," they said. "You knew, and you did nothing." The pressure grew, the weight of their accusations pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was drowning in my own guilt, my own fear. And the board was at the centre of it all, its presence a dark, malevolent force. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in the darkness. When I finally came to, the room was silent, the air heavy with a sense of finality. The board was still there, its message clear, its time. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me to end it, to end my suffering, to pay for what I had done. But I couldn't do it. I was too afraid, too desperate to cling to the last shreds of my sanity. I stumbled out of the room, into the cold night air. I had no plan, no destination. I just needed to get away, to escape the suffocating presence of the board. I walked for hours, my mind numb, my body on autopilot. I ended up in the woods, the same woods where I had lost my sister all those years ago. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, like skeletal fingers reaching for me. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, the memories of that day flooding back with painful clarity. I found the old well, now overgrown with weeds and moss. The sight of it made my stomach turn, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The board was waiting for me, its planchette moving slowly, deliberately. "End it," it spelled out. "Do it now." I felt a cold, suffocating dread settle over me. I knew what it wanted, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I stood there, staring at the well, my mind racing, and then I heard it, the sound of my sister's voice, calling my name. "Tom," she whispered. "Help me." I felt a surge of panic, my body trembling. I knew it wasn't real, knew it was the board's way of tormenting me, but the sound of her voice was so real, so close. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Tom," she said again, her voice more insistent. "Help me." I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the fear, the constant pressure, it was too much. I collapsed on the ground, my body shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." The board's planchette moved again, spelling out one final message. "End it. End yourself." I felt a strange sense of calm, a resignation. I knew what I had to do, but I was terrified. The board had won. It had broken me, forced me to confront the darkest parts of my soul, and now it was demanding the ultimate price. I stood up, my legs shaking, and approached the well. The darkness inside seemed to call to me, a void that promised an end to my suffering. I took a deep breath, the cold night air filling my lungs. "I'm sorry," I whispered one last time, before stepping into the darkness. As I fell, I felt a strange sense of peace. The board had known things about my past no one could have known, and it had finally gotten what it wanted. And then, there was nothing. I'm not sure how to explain what happened next. One moment I was falling into the darkness of the well. surrendering to the void that promised to end my suffering. The next, I woke up in a hospital bed, the harsh fluorescent lights burning my eyes. I was disoriented, my mind a haze of confusion and pain. The room was sterile, the beeping of monitors the only sound. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, unresponsive. I panicked, memories of the well and the board flooding back, the terror threatening to consume me. A nurse came in, her face a mask of professional concern. "You're awake," she said softly, checking the monitors. "You've been out for a few days. We were worried." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice barely a whisper. "What happened?" "You were found in the woods, unconscious," she said. "Some hikers came across you and called for help. You're lucky to be alive." The words didn't make sense. I should have been dead, should have ended it all in the darkness of the well. But here I was, alive and in more pain than ever. The nurse gave me some water and left, promising the doctor would be in soon. As I lay there, my mind racing, I realized something was different. The oppressive presence of the board was gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe, think clearly. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my soul. The doctor came in, a kind-looking man in his 50s. He explained that I had suffered severe dehydration and exposure, but that I would make a full recovery. I asked him about the board, about the well, but he just gave me a puzzled look. "There was no well," he said. "You were found lying on the ground, far from any structures." There was no sign of a board or anything like that. I didn't know what to believe. Had it all been a nightmare, some twisted hallucination brought on by guilt and fear? Or had the board finally gotten what it wanted, forcing me to confront my past and breaking its hold over me? Days turned into weeks, and I slowly recovered. My parents visited, their faces lined with worry and relief. I told them everything about the board, the messages, the guilt that had consumed me for so long. They listened, their eyes filled with pain and understanding. "We never blamed you, Tom," my mother said, her voice trembling. "It was an accident. You were just a child." But I knew better. It hadn't been an accident, not entirely. The board had forced me to face the truth, to admit what I had buried for so long, and in doing so, it had freed me from its grip. When I was finally discharged, I returned to my apartment, half expecting to find the board waiting for me, but it was gone, as if it had never existed. I searched every corner, every closet, but there was no sign of it. The apartment felt empty, but also strangely peaceful. I started to rebuild my life, piece by piece. I went back to work, reconnected with friends, tried to move forward. The nightmares still haunted me, but they were less frequent, less intense. I began to see a therapist, someone who could help me make sense of everything that had happened. Through it all, I kept thinking about Mark. He had disappeared that night, and no one had seen or heard from him since. I filed a missing person report, but there were no leads, no clues. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The guilt of his disappearance weighed heavily on me, another burden to carry. One night, as I was sorting through some old papers, I found a note Mark had left behind. It was scrawled in his messy handwriting, the words hurried and urgent. "Tom, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. The board is powerful, more than we understood. But remember, it's not just about the past. It's about facing your fears, confronting your demons. Don't let it win. Stay strong. Mark." The note brought tears to my eyes, a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. Mark had tried to help, had sacrificed himself to give me a chance at redemption. I owed it to him to stay strong, to keep fighting. I kept the note, a reminder of what I had been through, of the darkness I had faced. The board knew things about my past no one could have known, and it had pushed me to the brink. But in the end, it had also shown me the path to healing. Life moved on, slowly but surely. I still had moments of doubt, of fear, but I was learning to cope, to face my past without letting it consume me. The board had taken so much from me, but it had also given me a chance to start over, to find a new way forward. And so, I live with the memory of those dark days, the knowledge that some things can never be fully explained or understood. But I also live with the hope that I can move beyond the past, that I can build a future free from the shadows that once haunted me. I don't know if anyone will ever believe my story, if they'll understand the terror and the pain I endured. But I had to tell it, to share what happened in the hope that others might learn from my mistakes. So, if you ever come across a board like the one I found, please leave it alone. Don't play with things you don't understand. The past has a way of catching up with you, and some truths are too terrible to face alone. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But I'm also determined to live, to honour the memory of those I lost, and to find a way forward. It's not easy, and it never will be, but it's a start. And sometimes that's all you can ask for.